This is my presentation on poverty in the United Kingdom. What is poverty? Let's start with what is poverty. Poverty is a broad subject and the definition has changed largely over the last few decades and is hard to measure and hard to quantify. So through this presentation, I will be showing you how the government measures, what better measures could be used, and how we define poverty. On the whole, poverty is about exclusion. In its most extreme form, it's the ability to access what you need for a decent life. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation describes poverty as not being able to heat your home, buy essentials for yourself and your children, such as food or clothing, and facing insecurity and uncertainty in money or in your job. More than 1 in 5 people in the UK were in poverty in the year 2024, which is 21% of the population, according to Joseph Rowntree's Foundation. Poverty rates in England do vary by region, with West Midlands and London having the highest rates at 27%. There are multiple ways to measure poverty, but 2 main ways are absolute poverty and relative poverty. First, I will start with absolute poverty. Absolute poverty is when the criteria is not changed by economic growth compared to relative poverty, which is. The definition does not change over time and is fixed. People are considered in absolute poverty when the household income is not sufficient enough to afford basic necessities such as water, housing, food, and clothing. The United Nations uses this measurement a lot as it's easy to compare over different countries that would have different cultural needs. However, the UK government measures it slightly differently, and it defines absolute poverty as households with incomes below 60% of the median income in the base year, which is currently 2011. A flaw of this definition, however, is it's based on survival needs, such as just housing, food, and clothing. This doesn't reflect the modern way of living in the UK, such as families need Wi-Fi, they need transport, they need a phone to live in society today. And this definition does not take those into consideration. That is why there is also relative poverty. Relative poverty is the measurement the government uses that looks at households with income below 60% of median in that year compared to absolute poverty when the information is from a fixed year. So relative poverty changes every year. So the poverty line changes each year as it is based on income changes. It compares to other people's income, whereas absolute poverty compares to past income. So the threshold changes each year. The benefit of this measure is it gives a more accurate view of what people need to afford a normal standard of living, such as more than the basic necessities, such as Wi-Fi, transport, phones, clothing, and a safe home. And that is the difference between the two. Absolute poverty criteria is not changed by economic growth, but relative poverty, it is. So let's look back at how poverty has changed in Britain. Let's go back to the Industrial Revolution in the 19th and 18th century. So this changed the way the British economy worked, and you would think it wouldn't have worsened poverty, but it did, with the introduction of workhouses, child labour, overcrowded housing, and the Poor Law Amendment Act, which actually reduced government welfare benefits. It changed the system and encouraged the workhouse system. During this time as well, poverty was treated as a moral failing, and it was on the person and it was their fault for being poor and not for the wider society, such as low wages and low housing. Then came around the early 1920s when Charles Booth and Seb Rowntree did 2 research projects, one in York and one in London, which changed the way poverty was viewed. This social research actually led to how society viewed poverty, and it was not a moral failing, and it looked at how many people were actually affected in Britain at the time. After their research came out, welfare reforms were introduced, the first of their kind, such as free school meals, old age pensions, health insurance for low-paid workers, and unemployment insurance. They were the first of their kind in Britain and were the start of the sort of government welfare benefits that we see today. Then post-World War II, there was a report by an liberal economist called Beveridge, and this was published in 1942. And this was influential in the beginning of more welfare reforms. He proposed a system of social welfare reforms that could tackle poverty. The NHS service was part of this, and this was introduced in 1948 post World War II. This was a significant time in British history and was the first healthcare system in Western society to offer free medical care to the entire population. There was different reports at the time, and it was thought that poverty had been decreased immensely by a report by Rowntree that stated 4.8% of the working class households in York were in poverty in 1950 compared to 31% in 1936. And this was estimated to be because of the post-war labour reforms. However, in the 1960s, a more up-to-date report by Abel Smith and Townsend found that people living in poverty went from 8% to 14% since the 1950s. And this became a time when trying to find an accurate way of measuring poverty was looked into more, as these ways no one could actually get an accurate picture of what poverty was looking like at the time, and then you can't see if the policies that you're introducing are actually changing the way poverty is. So poverty in modern Britain today, around 1 in 5 people are in relative poverty, but that is before housing costs. We look at poverty now before and after housing costs, as housing costs can push a lot of people into poverty due to how expensive rent and mortgages are. Around 30% of children are in relative poverty, and that is after housing costs. And children are especially vulnerable. Around 22 to 22% of the UK population are in relative poverty before housing costs. However, this rises to 22 to 25% after housing costs. So that is the current picture of modern Britain's poverty. I got this information from the government's latest Households Below Average Income, which is an analysis of the UK income distribution, and this was last updated for the end of the financial year ending in 2024. Also, it identifies that there's higher risk groups such as children, single parent families, disabled people and workless households. However, having a job doesn't mean you can escape poverty, and a lot of these people are still in work, which points to more structural issues within society. So let's look at the way that we measure poverty. So the first way that we measure poverty is the HBAI measurement. So this means households below average incomes. This is where we look at households with 60% below the average income, and this is one of the measures the government uses. It takes into account the size of the households and all wages, including benefits. The current threshold is £15,000 a year for a single adult income, but this can change depending on the household size and housing costs. In 2025, it was reported by the UK government that 13.4 million people are living below this threshold. Then there is the persistent poverty measurement. Persistent poverty is measured by a household being below the poverty line for 2 out of the past 3 years. According to a report by the Social Metrics Commission, persistent poverty has actually risen over time. Almost 6 in 10 of those in poverty were living in persistent poverty in 2022, which is a rise of 4 percentage points since 2014. Lastly, there's absolute low income. This is the measurement that is, as I've previously talked about, is based on UK incomes in a set year, which is currently 2011. This measurement is helpful for the government to see if poverty has changed over time. However, it is based on income in 2011, so that is why all these measures are helpful to use at once, as you can't just solely base it on one measure, as it doesn't give an accurate picture. There is also the Social Metrics Commission, which has started as a new way to measure poverty. So this commission has decided to look at different ways to measure poverty, such as including all material resources, such as savings, which aren't included in the current government measurements. It also factors in unavoidable costs, such as childcare and disability costs. It also included housing conditions, such as homelessness and overcrowded housing. And it also includes an analysis of lived experience of poverty, which can actually talk to the people that are experiencing poverty today and how they are living life. So from their latest report, it found that 24% of the UK are in poverty and 2.1 million more people are in poverty today than 2020. Measuring this way is much better, I think, as it does incorporate more realistic of what is happening in society, as it includes those unavoidable costs such as childcare. That is why researchers on poverty want to use multiple different ways to measure poverty, as one doesn't give you a key look into how poverty is today in society. In conclusion, poverty is a very broad subject. It is about that exclusion from society and its inability to access what you need for a decent life. And for the last few decades, it has changed massively, and there is so many different ways to measure it, and it's hard to quantify. However, we need to measure it. We need to measure poverty, otherwise we can't look at how to improve poverty. And as we have seen, the figures are actually getting worse and poverty is deepening in the UK. The UK government currently favours the relative definition of poverty, which is based on the income for that year and changes every year. But as I said, the most recent figures are showing that poverty in Britain is deepening, and we need to look at what we can do to help this. Thank you.